Hello friends, welcome to the special lecture Symbolic Expression, and as a sign language expert we have Manisha Sharma with us in the studio, and today we will talk about imperialism. And in the earlier lectures on imperialism we talked about that how imperialism emerged during the modern period, and we see how imperialism is spread across the world. And nowadays we also talk about the idea of new imperialism as well, which is in the context of the transnational corporations. So, in the course of the discussions earlier, when we talked about imperialism, we talked about its definitions, we talked about the kind of theories which are there with regard to imperialism, the economic theories and the non-economic theories, and various scholars, those who have talked about imperialism and how they have tried to distinguish imperialism with empire or imperialism with colonialism. And many a times we also see that how the capitalist development was one of the indicators during this particular period, and how imperialism and capitalism, they were linked as well. So, in that context, when we see that kind of a process of the capitalist development which leads the capitalist countries to conquer and dominate the pre-capitalist countries of the world. So, that is being seen in the framework of imperialism, and how it is also a system of political control exercised by the metropolis over the domestic and the foreign policy, and the domestic politics of another polity, which we call in a way periphery, or the countries which are at the margins, maybe from the economic point of view. And we also talked about with regard to the phases or the stages of imperialism, and how the initially mercantilism and early trading empires, they were there, industrial and finance, and how Europe, it became one of the dominant powers in that sense, which was the driving force, where we see that the less developed countries of the world, they were being exploited for the growth of Europe. And we also see that how European countries, they came into some kind of a struggle with each other also, where we find that how all of them at different points of time, they in a way encourage the introduction of the new military techniques, whether the long range armed sailing ship, and how they helped the naval powers of the West to control the sea routes, which were an important context, important development at that point of time. And we see that how sea routes, they played an important role in the world commerce at that point of time, when we did not have railways, we did not have the aircrafts. So, in that sense their role was very important, and it was also in a way concerned or linked to the increased military power, that how it combined with the economic progress to push Europe forward and ahead of other continents as well. And we find the geographical explorations which were there during this time, and how geographical explorations, they played an important role. And through the discoveries of the various sea routes during this period, we find that they also played an important role in the world commerce as well. Especially we find it that how route to Indies via the Cape of Good Hope, and it had great consequences for Europe in that sense. And we find that these kinds of discoveries, trades and conquest, they had practical consequences as well, and every colony or the trading center was a new economic stimulus as well. And we find that how different countries of the world, they became the colony of European countries. And with regard to Britain, it is generally being said that the sun never set on the British Empire, and it was because of the fact that so many countries, they were the colonies of Britain, and at one or the other time sun was there, sun was shown in that manner in these particular colonies. And we see that how in that sense when we find that all these geographical explorations, all these kinds of trade and commerce, they benefited Europe in that sense, that how they were able to establish contact with Asian and African countries, and over a period of time they were able to utilize the resources of these regions to their own advantage. And we see that during this particular period, how over a period of time we see that America also became some sort of market when it became a colony of Europe, and thereafter when it became independent as well, its dominance also grew over a period of time. And we see that how the American bullion, it increased, and the supply of money circulating in Europe, it also increased, and it in a way also helped them to intensify the existing economic and the social developments. And we find that they also led to some kind of changes in the social sphere as well. And when you talk about America, we find that how it satisfied hunger for the land among the Europeans, and the kind of resources which were available there, gold and silver, it stimulated the exploration and the conquest, and it attracted the immigrants as well, who were followed close on their heels by the missionaries as well. So we find that how the American colonies, they were being set up by the individuals, and the state patriotism and how missionary impulses, they also played some kind of a little part in them. So over a period of time we find that these kinds of colonies, they were benefiting the colonial rulers. And initially, when we tend to understand the European powers, we find Spain and Portugal, they were the preeminent imperial powers initially. And as we find that they were in a way first discoverers, but we also see that they had around 4 to 5 models for effective colonization, which were typical of the first colonial empires as well. And both these powers, Portugal as well as Spain, they made a lot of profits from the kind of trade in which they engaged themselves. And we find that Portugal had a huge empire in Asia, and then in America and Brazil, and which in a way increased their revenues as well. The kind of money which was generated in the colonies was enormous. And we find that how one of the important features of Portuguese empire was that she made no distinction between her colonies and the metropolis, and no separate colonial department was set up till 1604. And we see that when this kind of money was being made in the colonies, we find that colonial revenues, they brought in equivalent to 72,000 pound sterling in 1711, and this was almost equal to metropolitan taxes. And when we see other countries like France, Spain and Portugal, they also carried out expansion in Americas, in the regions of Canada and Latin America as well. And we find that these were undertaken by individual Frenchmen who were supported by Crown, with the aim of ensuring supplies of groceries and increased naval power as well. And we find that initially the task of setting up of the empire was also carried out by the chartered companies as well, and this worked to the advantage of the state, as it was at a minimum cost. And this could be seen in the framework of the East India Company, which was established in Britain, or the East India Company of France, and so many other companies which were the chartered companies which were set up in Netherlands or Portugal, Spain. So all of them, they played an important role in that sense, in terms of setting up the empires for their rulers. And we see that how the western states, some of them, they developed their colonies in tropics, in India, Africa, Latin America and Australia, and how Europeans did not settle in Africa. They were content with the slaves, gold, dust and ivory which was coming from there. And colonies, they were also crucial to the British economy, as they supplied raw materials and were markets for the metropolitan products. So, we find that this exchange which was happening at that point of time, where we find that how colonies, they were being used for the resources which were available in these colonies. And we also find that when due to the industrial revolution, when it took place in Britain initially and then it spread to other parts of the world, and because of the industrial revolution, more and more products, they were being manufactured in the factories of the world, and these products, they had to be in a way exported to other regions, because we find that large quantities of products, they were being made, and all of them, they could not be consumed within the home markets. So, these colonies also served as sources of the markets as well, where we find that these the products, they could be sent to these regions. And when you talk about the big powers of those times, whether France, Britain, Austria, Russia and Prussia, all these five European powers, they had many advantages at that point of time, and how we find that they had a developed banking and a financial system, and a developed banking and financial system was very important from the economic point of view. And we also see how Europe, when you see the location of Europe, and when we see the various countries which are also playing an important role, especially Britain for that matter, because we find that industrial revolution took place in Britain, and thereafter we find that industrial revolution is spread to other regions of the world. And so, Britain, in a way, because of her geographical location, it helped her to maintain a distance from the continent when she wished. And another important factor which gave Britain an edge was that it was first country to undergo industrial revolution, and this enabled it to dominate Europe and to acquire the colonies. So, in that sense, the importance of Britain in that context could be realized, that it was the first country where industrial revolution took place, and thereafter we find that it spread to other parts of the world. So, apart from the geographical factors which were important, we also see that the kind of entrepreneurship which was exhibited by the people at that point of time, or the technological developments which were happening there. And also we find that agricultural revolution also first took place in Britain, and the emergence of the agricultural revolution also played an important role in terms of the industrial revolution later. And when we talk about the countries which were engaged in imperialist tendencies, that how they were able to create some kind of an empires for themselves, and these empires represented the European ambition, determination and ingenuity in using the limited resources rather than European predominance throughout the world. And we also see scholars like Doyle, they have in a way argued that Christendom is also proper perspective from which to view religious drive behind Spanish justification for empire. So, we find that how religion definitely also played an important role in terms of the spread as well, and this also we also see in the framework of India as well, where East India Company allowed so many missionary activities in India, and how Sirampore missionaries and other missionaries, they played an important role in terms of converting Indians to Christianity. So, that was an important aspect. Apart from the trade and commerce, we find that this kind of a conversion which was carried out by the missionaries here in India and elsewhere as well across the world, it also played an important role in terms of their ambitions. And Doyle has again talked about the Spanish and the British Empire, and he has argued that the Spain and Britain, they focused on trade in the East, on the settlement and production in the West, and neither required the colonies for the immediate reasons of national security. And we also see that over a period of time, this kind of a pattern, it also witnessed some kind of a decline, where we find that the old colonialism had its natural limits as well, where we find that the flow of the precious metals it declined, and by late 18th century Spanish and Portuguese power, they declined and they lost their colonies in that sense as well. We also see that how initially the countries which were dominant in terms of their imperial and colonial tendencies, they took a back seat, and Britain emerged as the most dominant nation which could secure the largest number of colonies. And we find that when you talk about this kind of a decline, then the Dutch monopoly on the shipping also ended, and we find that how colonial rivalry between the Britain and France, it ended in Britain's preeminence, where we find that Britain was now some kind of a world leader in empire, finance and trade. And this we could see in the framework of the Carnatic Wars, 3 Carnatic Wars which were fought in India, and at the same time how Britain and France, they were fighting wars at their home as well. And we find that how this kind of a dominance of Britain in India could be witnessed in the framework of their defeating France in the 3 Carnatic Wars. And when one talks about that how scholars they have seen, then Eric Hobsbawm has argued that the old colonialism did not grow over into new colonialism, it collapsed and was replaced by it. So we in a way find that how the kind of change which took place in this kind of atmosphere, in this kind of an idea which was taking place, or it was germinating in that sense. And we find that how when we talk about the various kinds of phases, then we also talk about industrial capitalism, and it was in the framework of the imperialism of free trade. And Hobsbawm has in a way described the industrial capitalism or industrial revolution in Britain as that unusual moment in the world history when world's economy was built around Britain, and when she was the only world power, only imperialist, only importer, exporter and foreign investor. So we find that this kind of a preeminence of Britain was also because of the fact that the industrial revolution in Britain was an important moment, and how world economy was also built around Britain, and how it was an imperialist country, and how the imports and the exports, they were also dependent on Britain, and how it was also investing so much money across the world as an investor. So when you talk about how industrial revolution in a way made Britain as a workshop of the world, and it was true as well in the middle of the 19th century when she produced most of its coal, iron and steel. And when we see that this kind of a production, it also helped the other industries in Britain, and because of which we find that it was able to achieve that kind of a success and domination in the world economy. And when we talk about the industrial revolution, that how it was followed by the single liberal world economy in 1860s, possibly because of monopoly of Britain and final penetration of undeveloped world by capitalism. So we find that how industrial revolution which spread to other nations of the world, and over a period of time it also threatened the British monopoly as well, but for quite some time we find that Britain was able to hold its monopoly and its predominance. And how the capitalist tendencies which we see, they could also be seen when British government or East India Company for that matter at that point of time, or later the British government, they started investing money in the colonies to recover the kind of investments which they had made. And when you talk about the British industrial economy, which was in the initial part, how it relied for its expansion on the foreign trade and the overseas markets for the products and the overseas markets outlets for the capital, they were crucial as well. And the cotton industry, it exported 80% of its output at the end of the 19th century. And we see that the iron and steel industry exported 40% of its output in mid 19th century, and in return Britain bought specialized local products such as cotton from US, wool from Australia, wheat from Argentina, etc. So, this kind of an exchange was also happening at that point of time, and how the different industries which were at its peak in Britain, and how these industries were playing an important role in terms of increasing the production as well as meeting the demand of not only Britain, but across the world as well, where we find that these kinds of products which were being made in Britain, they were being exported to the rest of the world. And because of which we also see that how British industries, they were also thriving at this point of time. And we see that this kind of a trade it increased further when the empire also expanded, especially in the 19th and the early part of the 20th century, where we find that Britain, it was extending its empires beyond different kinds of frontiers. And we find that when you talk about various kinds of crops, for example cotton, where we find that the Latin America, especially imperialism, it accounted for the 35% of British exports in 1840. And the situation also changed after 1873, that how East absorbed over 60% of the British cotton exports, and there were sound economic reasons for Britain opposing these areas being opened up to others. So, we find that these kinds of changes, they were happening at this point of time, and how these kinds of changes were relevant from not only trading point of view, but from the point of view establishing the hegemony as well, and how Britain by 1815 had become preeminent world power, how it was able to combine its naval mastery, financial credit, commercial enterprise, and alliance diplomacy as well. So, in the course of a discussion, we will talk about further about imperialism. Thank you very much.